Around the midway point of both the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, gamers were treated to a mid-generation refresh. Sony and Microsoft's goal was simple here. It was to provide extra oomph to power 4K displays, which were becoming more prevalent at the time, and also offer gamers more stable frame rates or higher frame rates in games. The base systems were certainly starting to struggle, particularly the Xbox One on a 4K display. And of course, when Microsoft launched the Xbox One X, it's hard to deny, it looked pretty damn phenomenal, actually performing better arguably than a lot of PC systems that were available at the time, at least for a decent price. So the big question on everyone's mind is, will Sony and Microsoft follow suit? Again, will we see a PlayStation 5 Pro and an Xbox Series Z? Well, we're going to get right into it after this message with the video's sponsor.
If you're running a copy of Windows 10 which isn't activated, of course, not only do you have to worry about the missing customization options, but there's also that annoying Windows desktop watermark reminding you to activate. Today's video is sponsored by WhoKeys.com, and they have an excellent price on Windows 10 Professional as well as Home keys. Yeah, and they also of course sell games. I've bought a few Windows 10 keys with my own personal account to test everything was legit and worked in preparation for this sponsored video. You can pick up one of their keys for 25% off using the coupon code RGT in the checkout. There's links to their website in the video description. Also, if you're building a few systems, there's bundles available too. Again, you can check out WhoKeys.com and use the coupon code RGT for 25% off the listed Windows 10 key prices.
Something interesting recently happened with leaks claiming that certain developers already have development kits in their hands for the mid-generation console refresh, these so-called pro consoles. These early development kits, of course, allow lucky developers to start having an understanding of what tweaks Sony and Microsoft have implemented to their respective hardware. Unfortunately, as of the time I'm putting this script together, there's absolutely no hint as to the specifications of these pro consoles. The Rockstar Insider, Tez2, merely states that they are certain that it is happening and that it, quote, isn't a guess. I'll also add that this is not the first time we've heard murmurs of a refresh, outside of the 6nm PlayStation 5, which has the same hardware specifications of course, albeit a smaller die, and with cost reductions across the board for the rest of the bill of materials. TV manufacturer TCL earlier this year held a presentation where supposed specification targets of the next generation consoles were shown, with an RX 7700 XT GPU being listed. This is essentially an RDNA 3 based card, specifically based on the Navi 33 GPU. This is the lowest entry into the RDNA 3 lineup, and with my own sources along with others online, it seems to indicate that this GPU will have 4096 shaders and be roughly on par with AMD's current RX 6900 XT in raster performance, give or take depending on the resolution, and likely ahead when it comes to ray tracing. Navi 33 will be found both in mobile as well as of course desktop. Now, to be clear here, the desktop RX 6900 XT graphics card absolutely dwarfs either the Xbox Series X or PlayStation 5 in raw performance. Well over double that in overall performance, and when discussing other simpler terms such as the number of shaders and T-flops, or more accurately FP32. Consoles of course though use customized hardware, and cut elements which aren't necessary for a specific task, i.e. play video games, and streamline their operating system and APIs significantly to reduce overhead and improve performance. This allows developers to really delve deeply into the hardware and squeeze as much out of the console as it can versus a similarly spec'd PC system. Now, you may recall, if you are a regular viewer, that I'd previously discussed a PlayStation 5 Pro and performance targets prior to the TCL leak. In fact, I'd also mentioned Microsoft were working on a mid-generation console refresh, but I'd heard that it was possibly coming after the PS5 Pro. The performance, I was told, essentially would double that of the PlayStation 5 in raster performance. To clear things up, raster means traditional graphics. This means without ray tracing that you see in titles like Cyberpunk or Spider-Man, and a 2.5 times increase in ray tracing. This would line up, roughly speaking anyway, with TCL presentation, assuming their information and my own is even slightly accurate. It's worth noting, of course, that consoles generally go through multiple design considerations and concessions. Upgrades and other changes can occur close to launch, let alone a system which is still relatively far away. Remember, the vanilla PS4 console had only 4GB of GDDR5 memory, which got doubled for launch. Or how about when Microsoft bumped the clock frequency of the Xbox One CPU and GPU prior to the console's launch? Indeed, sometimes there are totally different competing designs. I'll not go into histories such as an old console like the Dreamcast much here, but essentially there were two consoles being created. If you were around back then gaming, you may recall there were a lot of conflicting rumours, and that's because that the first Dreamcast design that we know today was actually based on PowerVR. It was the GPU, and the SH4 acted as the CPU processor. The other design, though, was rather different, and used the now-defunct 3DFX's Voodoo chipset, although we don't know the exact configuration for its graphics solution. Also, worthy of note is that the performance targets here seem roughly in line with what we saw with the PS4 to PS4 Pro, which was roughly 2.25 times increase in GPU performance. I've spoken to a couple of different sources on this, and honestly the information that I've received is pretty conflicting. One is adamant that development kits, particularly for the PlayStation 5 Pro, do exist, but they seem to be leaning on the fact that they are only internal right now. So perhaps some internal teams, for example with Sony, they may be with, say, some of their first-party studios, for example Naughty Dog, that's just an example, but they don't seem to be part of a wider range of developers. So for example, Rockstar may not have them. But another source told me the exact opposite, and they seem to think that some studios, some of their partners do have them. Honestly, I don't know. It could be that one person is mistaken or one has old information. With this stuff, of course, you're basically dealing with Chinese whispers. Again, though, the individual TES2, the Rockstar Insider, generally has pretty good information. Now, I'd personally heard a target of late 2023 for the launch of the hardware, but it's possible that either this date could be changed, or the fact that the hardware itself could just simply be canned by either Sony or Microsoft or both companies, and instead they move towards a 10th generation of consoles. As a slight aside, I don't think we're going to move towards a streaming future by the 10th generation. I think that both Sony and Microsoft will continue to push out their respective systems for some time, and there's still a lot of room in the tank, honestly, to improve performance, and I think Sony in particular wouldn't really want to give up a console in your living room. Another person had told me specifically, in fact, that a next-generation Xbox had already started its initial design discussions, but there was nothing solid that I was given in terms of specifications. My guess is that nothing is set in stone right now, and there's probably several competing designs. So honestly, even if I did have specifications to share with you guys, it would probably be all moot by the time that the console launched anyway. Now, another very interesting thing concerns the ray tracing capabilities of these next generation consoles. Going back to my own performance targets, remember raster was 2 times increase over the PS5, whereas RT was 2.5. RDNA 3 does launch this year on PC. With the highest end SKUs, Navi 31. This will power cards such as the RX 7900 XT and 7950 XT. Rumours from myself and others, though, those seem to indicate that we see significant RT improvements of this architecture. Curiously, Nvidia's RTX 40 series, known as Lovelace, has seen a number of architectural advancements over its predecessor. These include, but not limited to, displaced micromeshes and opacity micromasks, as well as adjustments on how shaders process work, particularly in ray tracing. I've gone much deeper into this in a separate video after I was briefed by Nvidia along with other members of the press, but in essence, displaced micromeshes use fancy tricks to look at the underlying simplified geometry and use a single triangle for BVH, bounding volume hierarchy information. It can use this as a base structure and then use this to figure out what to do with the much more complicated model. Now, BVH is essentially what's used to essentially analyze what it's basically a data structure to figure out what rays of light essentially will interact with what objects in a scene. And doing this, actually utilizing this technology, displaced micromeshes, actually drastically reduces both the time, build time, and data size of BVH. As for opacity micromasks, well, they're excellent for smaller objects which would be intensive to build from more complicated geometry. Think of a leaf. Rather than building a leaf from a complicated set of geometry, a developer can instead use a box which mimics the rough shape of a leaf in terms of the size, for example, and then can paint a texture of the leaf onto the box. The box itself is not visible, but the texture is. When RT though is being calculated, things can become more complicated. Rays are cast into the scene and collide with, say, the leaf. Let's pretend it's overhead in a canopy of trees along with, well, lots of other leaves. So this, of course, would cast shadows on the ground below you. But what happens is, as these rays are being, fired into the scene, it doesn't just collide with the texture of the leaf, but potentially also the invisible box. So what can occur with older ray tracing implementations outside of what NVIDIA have created here is that the GPU then needs to actually figure out, by doing a bunch of instructions, what actually occurs when a ray collides with an invisible box, thus reducing performance. This can also occur for other things as well, for example, smoke and flames and anything else. So it can be quite a big deal. From what I'm told though by a few people under the table, NVIDIA have essentially given this to the DirectX DXR spec, meaning it could also be incorporated in other hardware such as RDNA 3. Now, you need to come back after the 3rd of November to see whether AMD confirms this or not, in other words, being part of RDNA 3, as that's when the company will reveal its next generation GPU architecture. But even if not, it doesn't mean it's not part of the next generation consoles. PS4 Pro, for example, launched between the release of AMD's Polaris and AMD's Vega graphics architecture, but did include some Vega features, despite the architecture not being released for desktop for about a year later. Long story short, features and bring up can change, and the IP being brought up on console first can occur, or it could be brought to desktop first and then be brought to console. And don't also get hung up on the DirectX thing. Remember, these technologies also will be given to, for example, Vulkan, which is part of the Kronos group, and honestly, any IP shared most likely with AMD can also be used on Sony hardware, and it's quite complicated. NVIDIA releasing these features actually to a DirectX spec isn't surprising at all. If you've been following PC hardware for any length of time, you'll know that the first implementation of mesh shaders wasn't actually from Microsoft with DirectX Ultimate. It was actually from the Asteroids demo from NVIDIA, which launched alongside their Turing demo. And then after that, we of course saw NVIDIA Adaptive Shading. This was kind of a precursor to VRS. Both mesh shaders and NAS ran on custom extensions from Kronos Group's Vulkan API. As an aside, I've got a couple of very interesting interviews from the folks over at Kronos Group, by the way, on the channel, and I'm working on getting another one sorted out fairly soon. It's taking a bit of time because there's a lot of stuff going on at Kronos, so we're trying to organize things. But it's pretty exciting, so of course subscribe if you want that. So let's get into some speculation, shall we? I want to stress that this is not a leak, this is a guess. But based on what we've seen from the base consoles, as well as what we saw from the previous generation, as well as all of the rumours concerning RDNA 3, and of course what we know about Zen 4 and some other things, I think we can get a fairly rudimentary understanding of what directions Microsoft and Sony will steer their next generation hardware. Now, this is possibly going to disappoint some people, but I'm very skeptical that we're going to see additional CPU cores enter the fray. I know it's a very popular, better speculation online that we're going to see something like 12 CPU cores, and that, they'll have ridiculous clock frequency and a whole massive amount of cache and all of that stuff, but I don't think this is likely. It would increase the physical footprint required on the CPU cluster inside the APU, which of course is very sensitive to space. The bigger it is, the more expensive it is to produce, not to mention the fact that the more power it requires, and so on and so on. But also, when you have additional cores, you need to feed them, for example, cache. And more CPU cores also need to be kept physically fed with data, which is extra work from developers. Developers basically need to code a game to work across all of these different CPU cores, because otherwise, if they're not active most of the time, they're basically just pointless. So I think a much more logical direction is for AMD to offer one of its upgraded CPU IPs to Sony and Microsoft, such as Zen 4. Zen 4 for desktop is currently out and will be launching early next year, it looks like, for mobile. We're going to see huge energy efficiency improvements. We've already kind of seen those for desktop, especially at lower clock frequencies. Large performance gains. Zen 3 to Zen 4 wasn't a big IPC uplift. However, Zen 2 to Zen 3 certainly was, and Zen 2 to Zen 4 definitely would be. Plus, of course, we have high clock frequencies as well. Zen 2 basically formed the basis of the current generation of consoles. So tweaks using the same number of CPU cores, but giving each core significantly more grunt makes a lot of sense to me. It's the same strategy that Microsoft and Sony employed with the previous generation, and it's very effective. Most games will be GPU bound, pushing higher resolutions generally speaking. But faster and more efficient CPUs will help lock higher refresh rates such as 120Hz during performance modes, and potentially also just give a little bit of extra headroom to developers because some stuff still does require CPU work such as some RT. GPUs though, it's a lot more difficult to know exactly what the company will do. Assuming TCL 7700 XT rumour is accurate, which again is based on N33, we're looking at up to 4096 shaders, assuming that the custom design from the consoles doesn't go above that, as it potentially could, and this would mean 16 workgroup processors. RDNA 3 makes it even more difficult to figure out exactly what's going on over RDNA 2 because the workgroup processor itself has changed pretty fundamentally. Essentially, we seem to have double the number of shaders per workgroup processor, so it goes up to 256 rather than just 128. From what AMD themselves have already officially confirmed, energy efficiency is up about 50% as well, and we know that clock frequency is going to be a big deal for RDNA 3 because they've officially stated it. I would expect that there's going to be some type of hybrid design. For example, I'm very skeptical Sony would just go for a straight RDNA implementation. I suspect we're going to see the return of the geometry engine, not only because of the legacy of the PS5, but Sony obviously are pretty happy with how that's gone with the PS5, and obviously they can customize the design based upon their SDKs and whatever they're trying to do internally. I suspect also Microsoft will do pretty much the same thing. But my guess is there will be a number of differences, not only in terms of the implementation, but for example, the number of shaders and how Microsoft and Sony maximize the performance for their specific vision. For the PlayStation 5, Sony went with a narrower GPU design, aiming to maximize throughput and data speed through the caches. Microsoft, meanwhile, went with a wider design with more ALU, which does help to carry out more parallel work, but neither design is perfect. They both have some flaws, so strengths and weaknesses in both, and ultimately which one's better does come down to the game engine. From everything I understand though, Sony and Microsoft feel that the future is ray tracing. I don't think these upgraded machines though will have enough grunt to go towards full scene path tracing. Nvidia are clearly moving this direction with RTX 40, but it will take some time I think for the consoles to get there, probably PS6 or onwards. My guess is Sony and Microsoft will push towards higher resolution gaming, and perhaps we've already seen a preview of what Sony's teams are working on with their 1080p efforts in ray tracing, for example with Ratchet & Clank. 60 FPS average, or perhaps even going towards 120 with the next generation consoles. Don't forget too that the PS VR 2 will be launching, and I suspect that the PS5 Pro, if it does exist, and ultimately all of this stuff could be totally and utterly rubbish and just not be true at all, but if the PS5 Pro does exist, I suspect a really big reason for it to exist, well, it's really simple. It is, of course, to help make PS VR 2 games look even better and add ray tracing. We're left with no shortages of questions of what's going to happen with the next generation consoles, let alone this mid-generation refresh. I don't think that consoles physically are going anywhere anytime soon, despite the fact that xCloud, for example, has been relatively successful for Microsoft. I think that we can argue that for at least another console generation or two, the physical box isn't going anywhere. It also allows companies like Sony, of course, to retain much stricter controls over its platform. As for a mid-generation refresh, I would encourage you guys, as leaks start to emerge, to analyze them very simply. Not just from a technical perspective of how many T-flops they are, but ask yourself, does it make sense from a technical perspective what specifications you're starting to see? For example, if there's like 16 CPU cores or 32 CPU cores in the leak, you can pretty much dismiss it. Not only does it eat up a crap ton of die space, as we've already discussed, but here's the other thing. What benefit does it actually bring to developers? You're better most likely to go with a smaller number of cores, which are easier to program for, easier to maximize the throughput, and ultimately it just is easier in terms of power budget, design, and then they would probably put that die space instead to things like, I don't know, GPU cores. There's going to be a lot of intriguing developments, I think, over the next couple of years. Obviously, the big elephant in the room is also Nintendo. Previously on the channel, quite a number of months ago, actually, I think it was well over a year ago, I leaked the fact that they were working on a Switch Pro / Switch 4K. And then that was almost certainly confirmed by a leak which originated within NVIDIA, as it basically discussed DLSS, or Deep Learning Super Sampling, which seemed to be targeting a new variant of the Switch. This would essentially require an entire new GPU architecture. I don't want to go too much into this, but basically speaking, that variant of the Switch seemed to have been pulled away from internal development teams, and then it was being reworked. As of the time I'm recording this, there was no official confirmation from Nintendo that a new version of the Switch, or whatever it ends up being called, it could be called Mario's Left Boot for all we know, actually exists. But I think we can agree that they are working on something. Ultimately, it's going to be a very intriguing generation of consoles going forward, and PC hardware is getting a huge boost. RTX 40 is roughly double the performance of RTX 30. AMD's RDNA 3 is looking to do roughly the same thing. And of course, PC hardware is significantly more expensive, but this stuff is also going to trickle down to the lower end, and it's going to make things very interesting, I suspect, for gamers. The other fact too is that from the likes of Microsoft as well as Sony, as they're porting these games over to the PC, and this is a guess, but I don't think they would want a huge visual parity difference between the two systems. Sure, at the end of the day, someone who's dropping like $1,500, $2,000 on a graphics card, they're obviously going to be able to outperform a console. But, I don't know, there is also a market for premium systems as well. It's going to be very interesting to see how all of this goes. I've got a lot of thoughts on this, but I think ultimately we'll know a lot more after AMD hosts their RDNA 3 event, and we start to get a much better understanding as to what the hardware is actually capable of. With that said, thank you very much for watching the video. If you've enjoyed it, it's YouTube, you know what to do, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.